Every time you try to predict what this trade will do, you create emotional investment in being right. And that investment makes you inconsistent. Because now it's not just about executing your edge, it's about being right. And those are two different things. One keeps you consistent. The other keeps you reacting to whether the market validated your prediction. That's where the problem starts. Not with your analysis, with the need to be right about what happens next. Prediction creates attachment to outcome. You form an opinion about what the market will do, and suddenly you have something to defend. When the trade moves against you, it doesn't just mean the trade is losing. It means you were wrong. And that feeling triggers all the reactivity that keeps you inconsistent. You hold longer than your plan says because you still think you're right. You move your stop because you don't want to admit the prediction failed. You're not trading probabilities anymore. You're defending your prediction. Probability thinking is different. It doesn't predict. It accepts. When you think in probabilities, you acknowledge that this trade could go either direction, and your edge doesn't depend on which one it chooses. You have a bias based on your analysis, sure, but that bias isn't a prediction. It's a framework for execution. You're not saying, this will happen. You're saying, if my setup appears and I execute, I've done my job, regardless of the outcome. That detachment from needing to be right about this specific trade is what creates consistency. Because now you're measuring yourself by execution, not by whether the market did what you thought it would. The market doesn't care what you predicted. It doesn't care that your analysis was solid or that the setup looked perfect. The market is probabilistic, not deterministic. It doesn't follow rules. It follows probabilities. And probabilities mean that any outcome is possible on any trade, even when your analysis is correct. You can read the setup perfectly and still lose. That's not failure. That's how probability works. The trade that should have worked didn't. The next one might. Your edge doesn't show up in predictions. It shows up in the aggregate. And if you're attached to being right on this one, you'll never get to the aggregate. Here's what prediction does to your trading. It makes you hesitate when the setup appears, but doesn't match your prediction of how it should look. It makes you overtrade when the market moves the way you predicted, because now you think you're seeing clearly. It makes you revenge trade when you were right, but the trade's still lost because that feels unfair. It creates emotional volatility tied to outcome instead of discipline tied to process. And all of that inconsistency comes from one thing: needing to be right about what happens next. Let go of that need, and most of your emotional triggers disappear. Letting go of prediction doesn't mean you stop analyzing. You still do your work. You still identify your edge. You still have a bias. But you stop treating that bias like a forecast. You stop emotionally investing in being right. Your analysis creates the framework for execution. It tells you when your setup is there and when it's not. That's all it needs to do. Once you're in the trade, the outcome is out of your hands. You executed your process. The market does what it does. And whether it moves in your favor or not, doesn't validate or invalidate your work. The only thing that matters is whether you followed your plan. This is what probability thinkers understand. You don't need to know what happens next to have an edge. You don't need to be right on this trade to be profitable over time. What you need is a process that creates a probability advantage and the discipline to execute it without attachment to individual results. The market will give you wins and losses. You don't control the distribution. But if you keep executing without trying to predict each outcome, the probabilities work in your favor. That's the game. Not being right. Playing the probabilities. So stop trying to predict. Stop creating emotional investment in whether this trade validates your analysis. Your edge is statistical, not magical. It doesn't require you to be right about what happens next. It only requires you to be consistent in execution. And the moment you stop needing to be right on this trade, you become consistent in a way that prediction will never allow. Because prediction makes you reactive, probability makes you disciplined, and discipline is what compounds over time.